Now, over the life of the project, as I've mentioned already, risks can change. Maybe they become more or less likely, or maybe the impact changes, higher, lower, or the impact is different in some way. Also, new risks may emerge that could not have been known about when carrying out the various risk processes within the planning process group. So therefore, risk management needs to be updated so that it can be kept current and accurate. This is what this particular tool is all about. And of course, the risk register is a vital reference here, as it will give data on the current status of all risks, and by the very nature of it, help you to identify new risks that have emerged that need to be added to the register and perform qualitative risk analysis and perform quantitative risk analysis be carried out on them. Risk audits. These focus on overall risk management and by the very nature are top-down. Periodic risk audits evaluate how the risk management plan is working, along with whether the identified risks are actually occurring. Like most audits, these should be seen as a great opportunity for an independent view to be taken on the overall risk management. And the fact that they are independent can often give a new set of eyes and spot situations or trends that the team, including the project manager, may not have noticed. It's also quite refreshing that after a risk audit to be given a clean bill of health, so that it gives you added confidence that the way in which risk management is being carried out is the best way for this particular project. Variance and trend analysis. This is looking at what was originally planned and what was actually executed. So it's comparing planned against actual and looking at variances between those two and looking at what was planned and what is forecast, again with a focus on the variances. Trend analysis shows how performance is trending. Trend information allows corrective action to be undertaken if needed. Now, we are talking here about risks. So with regard to this tool within the control risk process, we'd be looking at trend analysis on risks. In the next and final slide, I'm going to show you how it's quite normal and natural that the total risks on a project are greatest at the beginning because nothing has been done about them. But as you approach the end of the project, risks will be minimized since we've carried out all of the activities, created the products, and there won't be too many remaining. Always some, of course, called residual risk, which we'll look at again in the next slide. But here, for example, you could check that indeed risks generally are reducing, and if not, identify what the reason for that is, and that root cause analysis will help, as I've said here, corrective action to be undertaken. Technical performance measurement. As its name suggests, this looks at the technical or functional parts of the project and reviews technical accomplishments, for example products that have met their acceptance criteria, against the planned schedule of technical achievements. In other words, are we where we plan to be? And if not, determine again by root cause why not, and what are we going to do about it to bring it back on track. As it says here, looking at the deviation in terms of functionality or products can help forecast the degree of success the project is achieving at this point in time and give the project manager an opportunity to actually refine and hone that to bring the project back on track if indeed the variances don't look good. Reserve analysis, another name for this is the risk contingency fund. You'll recall I talked about that as one of the responses. It is evaluated to assure management that it is still sufficient. What happens in reserve analysis is looking at the original reserve put by, looking at risks that actually happened and that needed to utilise some of that funding, looking at risks that would still use it but have yet to happen, and determining whether the reserve analysis is still appropriate. You may need to increase it or decrease it if some or more of the linked risks actually didn't occur. Consider this. If there's still money there, then this will refer to potential activities that have yet to be implemented and to use this funding. Therefore, there may be an impact on schedule. If, for example, the number of risks to use contingency are still significant, but none of them have occurred yet, then we need to look at if they should all need this money, will this also have an impact on the future schedule of the project? And finally, meetings. This doesn't necessarily mean that you have risk-related meetings, although that might be appropriate in certain high-risk projects. What it's actually referring to is that when you have progress status meetings, talking generally about the project and its progress, schedule, cost, quality, scope and so on, that you should include within those meetings an agenda item of discussing the risk status, and that is quite a sensible thing to do. Just coming off topic for a moment, the regular management reports that will need to be circulated at key points should also include risk status within them. One final slide then, looking at residual and secondary risks. This is only a small point, but it's worthwhile just considering as a final thought before we leave the risk management knowledge area. We've been talking thus far about the risks that you'd identify within the identify risk process. For the sake of this slide, call these the primary risk. They're the main risks that's been identified. We then implement a response, any of the ones that we've discussed. And by the way, it's worthwhile mentioning that although I covered these responses individually, it may be appropriate in some cases to have more than one response implemented. So all of these responses are implemented, as we've already mentioned. There will still be some risk, and as I mentioned in the previous slide, at the very beginning of the project, that's where typically risks are at their greatest. Assuming that halfway through a huge risk doesn't come out of the blue, generally you've got all of the risks in front of you. As you gradually carry out the project, risks in general will reduce. At the point when you close the project, there will normally be some residual risks, and these risks will typically be those that may still occur when the end product is put into its operational life. However, by implementing the response to these risks, you may find that these, designed, if you remember, for the primary risk, may reduce or remove other risks, or indeed they may increase the other risks. But also, they may reduce or remove existing risks. This can happen. You'll find sometimes that risks are linked in some way. The other thing that implemented response might do is to actually create what's known as secondary risks. In other words, as a result of implementing some response, a new risk arises. So be aware of this when you're carrying out your workshops for risk analysis and determining which responses. Think through, would any secondary risks emanate from the response you're putting in place? Suppose that your project was implementing leading edge technology and the response was to accept current technology. The secondary risk to that might be that within a year's time the market for such technology may reduce. So as a result of making that choice and implementing that response, a new secondary risk has arisen. And just one final point before we leave risks, and that is that whenever implementing a response, consider the response effect on looking upwards at senior management, or perhaps your project's part of a program. Look at the response in terms of the business case, which is a balance between costs and benefit. Look at the response in terms of a project plan, or if you have sub-plans such as stage or phase plans, and of course write down at individual work package levels. So rather than just implementing a blanket agreed response against a risk, consider what the impact on those would be in, for example, these documents.